Okay, now we're leading into part two of this study on Gobekli Tepe and sacred geometry and how it hooks up through Knights Templar and a lot of other situations I've talked about here in part one. If you haven't seen it, then go to the end of this one and click in your top left hand corner. It should be part one, or you can go back to the regular site and look through it and see what we're at. I hope it didn't cut me off, but I have a feeling it did right there at the end, and so we're going to catch this and go on. Talking about sacred measurements that they have in this .83 modern meters or 2.7 feet was a megalithic yard, and it's used at Stonehenge, Pyramid, Giza, and numerous sites all around the Mediterranean region, and Heath proved this back in 1998. This unit is derived from three factors, actually the spin of the Earth on its axis, the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, and the mass of the Earth. It shows another connection when you look at Egypt, for it shows you the dimensions of the earth and that they understand that. And a lot of people have said, the pyramids are older than the Egyptians themselves, for they don't even really record it. It's odd, but they don't almost talk about it, which is strange. But these pyramids, if they were encased in casing stones, then the amount of erosion that we see on them is not equal to the amount that they would have gone through if they were built and then flat-sided. Then the amount of erosion that we have on it now from the time that we believe they got defaced wouldn't be at the point that we are now. But also it seems to be a geographic center of the mass of Earth, or at least in the old world, whole side of it there, for it's the pinnacle of not just ley lines, but almost the pinnacle of ley lines, almost like whenever you look at the geographic North Pole and you see it culminates there, there's a culmination that's there. And so that's looked at as being the belly button of the Earth. In fact, they say so, and that is that omphalos that we talk about. And Greeks had one too, and there's quite a few umbilical cords that come after that for mankind grows. Isn't it amazing how some of these things just symbolically fit? But if we think about it being the belly button of the earth, they have a belly button. But if we go with the story, Adam and Eve didn't have belly buttons, did they? But their children did. Didn't they? Yeah, and they knew about belly buttons of the earth all of a sudden somehow. So it didn't really happen all of a sudden somehow. I was trying real hard to get to this next picture. I always try to for any time it's going to cut into parts, but I just couldn't get there. I couldn't shut up. Thus, to arrive at this unit of measurement, you have to be extremely adept at astronomy. Without going into too much detail here, an engineering professor named Alan Butler from the University of Bradford found that the incorporation of 366 megalithic yards in ancient megalithic sites was used to, among other things, track the moon over long periods of time. This was presumably done to predict high and low tides for oceanic travel. Understand that concept. They already knew when the high tide, low tide was going to be. And you think, well, that surfers know about that. And it's like, come on. People knew when it was high tide and low tide. And they also tried to show up at docks and things at right times and things like that. People were going off time a lot earlier than people give credit for, and it wasn't necessarily a watch or a clock, but it was written in the stars and the sun. And the idea of a sundial goes back way, way longer than we have a recollection for. So here's an overview of Gobekli Tepe 2 before they put the potato chip on there, and the alignments of the main pillars. And this is 1, 2 of the third that's in the grouping of it. But there are other ones that attach to this. And I can't wait to see if they excavate it to the point that you might be able to get the rest of the geometry out of it. Oftentimes, this measurement is expressed through the circumference of the ancient hinges that surround a site. A megalithic circle contained 366 degrees. With this in mind, I turned my attention east. I learned through a UNESCO World Heritage nomination documentation that the official mound of which Gobekli Tepe is situated, has a diameter of 300 meters. I thought that would be interesting to see how many megalithic yards this was. The answer was 362. So, well, they weren't off by very much. Now, understand that we're talking about days of the year too, and 366, well, that's one too many. No, that's not one too many. You have to figure in things like leap year and stuff, but also look at the fact that whenever you go around the great cycle one time, it steps you 1 degree on. And so a circle, which the Sumerians had at 360 degrees, that we still use today, and was supposed to be sacred with the sky and timing and years and seasons and all of this, wasn't quite right. There was a 5-day gap that we used to use a ceremony for, a little festival, if you will, and then kicked into the rest of the year. And we didn't do it exactly at the time of the year that we do nowadays. There's a reason that we do it now 5 days after Christmas. It's the same connective. But if you were to go 365, if you go once around the maypole, knock knock, then you get 1 degree further. Then it takes 72 years to pass 1 degree. And that's another reason that's a sacred geometry, and it clicks like the cog that works inside of a clock. When the pendulum goes back and forth, and every time the pendulum swings, it goes click, that's 1 circumference. I thought that it would be interesting to see how many megalithic yards there was, and the answer was 362, a difference of less than 4 megalithic yards to the commonly used 366. Certainly, it's speculative, but the difference of 4 megalithic yards, or around 3.32 modern meters, or 10 feet, simply could be accounted for by an inaccuracy in the original measurement of Gobekli Tepe's diameter. Could be a lot of things. Could be in the fact they were figuring on the arch of the hill slightly versus the point, and so in effect making a baby bump pyramid in it. And if you figure in that arching of it but straightened it out, it would straighten out to be 365 or 366. I'm pretty sure it's more than 10 foot worth of declamation. What do you think? Yeah, somewhere around there. But before they built it into the mound and the titty thing that it is nowadays. So you look, and we talk about the tater chip that's here, it's over that, but you can see that it's over these other places. And if you look, they've planted, not anywhere else, but right here on top of it, these groves here. And that just reminds me of the Chinese pyramids that are grown on top of, and makes you wonder, well, what's under here? Maybe you ought to go out here and see if there's anything here, and then move all this to right there. Or is there some way, man? Yeah. So this is that circle I'm telling you about that surrounds the whole thing. And then they figured that here we go, and we declamation and start using sacred geometry into it. And where does Gobekli Tepe circles point out to be, and where they are? And this triangle comes out to be a portion measuring all through it, with the dots that are under there that you can't really see now because it's got a potato chip over the top of it. Wonder what's up under that titty. For there is 2. And you know, just break that third wall for a second here, as if I lived outside of it. We find this. This is not the origin. This is not the belly button. This is somebody that had a belly button. This is not where they come up with a belly button. You'll probably never find a little circle of stones that somebody could line up and blah, 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 that's kind of little bullshit, and rocks that people could, a couple of them could carry and stood up, that led to this, that led to this, that led to that, that led to this thing that we're looking at now. I understand it on that concept. This wasn't like, hey, popcorn, hey, let's make things and flat tees and da-da-da and carvings and bas relief and da-da-da. Come on. While I understand it's most likely arbitrary, the creators of Gobekli Tepe may have not have even planned out the site using this diameter, he says. Sure, if Gobekli Tepe was constructed using 366 megalithic yard parameter, this would suggest this unit of measurement was in existence at the end of the last ice age. This certainly supports the newfound Denisovan genetic link because this measurement is most highly used in and around the British Isles. The Denisovan DNA recorded today among both Finns and Icelanders, but also lost technology of the Denisovans may be found, especially regarding monuments where former Doggerland mass once stood and those to be seen to this day on the Orkney mainland. And this Andrew Collins, he's apparently gone Denisovan crazy lately, but I can understand it looking at some of the artifacts and some of the knowledge. But what we're looking at, I think, is an understanding that perhaps some of that knowledge was derived from the Denisovans and a culmination of people. In fact, with the genetics, it shows like, well, there was definitely contact with everybody, all of these people. And some of these people that we know have Denisovan contact and genetics in them also were extremely early boat people, i.e. made it to extreme islands and things like that, right? Well, here it is again too. But the thing to look at Scandinavia is at the height of the last ice age, it was covered over pretty much with an ice sheet up to its point. In Scotland and Ireland, we're peekabooing. So how long does this go back if it goes back in that area? And we're starting to look at far past dates. But hopefully one day soon, another site like this will be formed. Although I've got videos coming up on similar sites to this, but much smaller, not as grandiose, but of the same time. In fact, one dating beforehand. So it shows you, well, this must go before that, and it's got the T-pillars, and how long does this go back? And what is there before the T-pillars? Well, perhaps some of those dolmens should be re-looked at, and things and concepts. And what about all those hills here and the little bumps that are everywhere? And there's a bunch of them in America too that may not exactly go with what they've been saying. Riddles of Rosslyn Chapel in South Edinburgh. So now we're back into the Knights Templar, definitely into a modern age. Come on back with me. Let's go in this room of the haunted house. Made famous by Dan Brown's 2003 fictional masterpiece, The Da Vinci Code, everybody should be aware of, Rosslyn Chapel, lying a few miles south of Edinburgh, certainly deserves the air of uncertain mystery that shrouds its existence to this day. Built at the behest of William Sinclair of Rosslyn, an eminent Norwegian and Scottish nobleman and the last Earl of Orkney, the chapel was constructed in 1441 and 1490 as a copy of the ruined Jerusalem temple built by King Herod. As mentioned earlier, the Templar Knights were known to have excavated large areas of Jerusalem, and it's believed that William Sinclair found his inspiration in the creation of Rosslyn using rituals that he'd come up with him through scrolls found under the Jerusalem temple. And so if we found that and the ancient ruins that were there, this would have been an ancient temple to Baal and Inanna and El before the times of the Bible that got rebuilt, right? So a rebuilding of a rebuilding. So when was the third? Oh, that already happened then. Yeah, so did Armageddon. I've done videos about it. But when they come back from Babylon and gets rebuilt, they're turning a temple of someone else into the temple of someone new. Both researchers, Knight and Lomas, suspected that contained somewhere in the vicinity of Rosslyn Chapel is a collection of scrolls and other artifacts that the Templars brought back from the Holy Land, where they subsequently passed them down generation to generation until they ended up in the hands of St. Clair's, a family who incidentally became leading figures in Scottish Freemasonry in the later 16th century. It may be assumed that these were stored in a series of cave-like vaults alluded to in the Father Richard Augustus Hayes manuscripts, a 16th century prior who had open access to the history of the St. Clair family in Roslyn Chapel after his mother married into the St. Clair family. And most of the people that have studied this or looked into it at all realize what, if they were ever in that, there was a long time ago. And they probably aren't there anymore. In fact, they're probably somewhere you wouldn't be able to believe if someone told you. Given what's been covered in the rest of this article, namely the idea that the Solomon's original temple may have been inspired by astronomical observations, and the megalithic measurements originating from the European grooved-ware culture, who were now understand may be connected to the originators of Gobekli Tepe through a genetic Denisovan link, then it's entirely possible that if the Templars had really discovered scrolls under the original Temple Mount foundations, this information could well hold the clues as to what progenitor culture had seeded the information necessarily for the enigmatic megalithic culture sites we see across the world. And I say no. It looks like they already had that knowledge well and before this point. And if you want to add Denisovans had it in there, you haven't found a site yet that you say Denisovans exclusively were doing this. It can be some of the knowledge of working with things like stone. You see the bracelet of what they claim are Denisovan bracelets dating back 40,000 years, made out of a jade type material, green. And though it's broken, it's got a hole drilled through it and other stuff that we don't give credit for possibly even happening up until, well, we all agree with the Egyptians having this stonework in the very first times. It's still an part how they could build bowls like this, but somehow it's accepted. So we've got to throw 30,000 years and say 30,000 years before people were building stuff of this level. Look at this thing. See, doesn't that screw it all up? Because we're looking at 1,000 years, 500 more. Oh, 1,000 years before. Oh no, 37,000. It just doesn't make sense unless you say there's a lot of lost in between there. And when we look at that number too, we start to look at coming into and development of the last ice age and what had happened. So here's Roslyn Chapel and what's really left of it and built back off into it, and its pillared colonnaded style. And if you look, it actually has a measurement declination of these buttresses on the outside of it that look very similar to ancient Sumerian and the very first mastabas and temples of the Egyptians, where they have this niched architecture laid out like this. There's not windows in between or anything, but they want to let in light and let in knowledge. More evidence may one day link the Templars to Gobekli Tepe. Whatever the truth is, I believe that it's our job to seek answers, whatever they may lead us. And in light of new evidence, alongside older inquiries like Lomas and Knight's deep dive into the origins of Freemasonry, some very interesting things have been revealed, especially regarding the notion that the Templars' early foundation rituals may have been based on the same culture who were millennially intertwined with the paradigm-shifting Gobekli Tepe and its mysterious architects. Well, I'm not going to give the credit to the Denisovans for the circles that are there. For every other one, we really can't connect with them. In fact, no one could connect them with this at all either. In fact, they're pretty much a long gone people before this happens. There are beliefs that there are pocket remnants of mainly Denisovans that reach some 14, 15,000 BC and drift off into humanity. Well, do they drift off and get assimilated in, and that's what we're looking at? Well, that genetic interjection that he talked about seems like it happened way before that time, and or a slight amount twice perhaps, but not a gigantic amount. So also what we think of Denisovans quite often making dark skin somehow, but we can look at the hominid integration that made those people in the first place, and that's more where that comes in. And no, it's not black people that we call today. That's its own separate entity altogether and is not actually related to any of those genetically. And in fact, comes much later. Asillar man is the latest one, is the earliest form that we can find of it. Finding out whether or not the Templar Knights did in fact find something under Jerusalem may be imperative to understanding not just Gobekli Tepe but human prehistory in general. But while we are led directly to Rosslyn Chapel and the non-fictional part it may play in decoding these mysteries, we can only follow the clues as far as they lead us, and we will be patient, persistent, but if we are able to get our answers in the end. Well, we're all searching for answers. In fact, I'm searching for pieces of other answers for other things and see if I can go. And what's funny is what ends up happening is you end up making connections. Once it's laid out the puzzle, you're really just, when you find a piece, you're making connections. And quite often it's not just connected to this puzzle piece, but this other puzzle piece here too. In fact, sometimes you can find things like the way geometry is laid out and so on, and then people have it and then people that don't, and you go, well, at least these people influence these people in some way, shape, or form. For there are some people that used to build round houses that started to build things on square, but you can square a circle and oh, hey, snap. Onward to the next story. Peace.